What would you do if your own blood left you to die in the desert? This is the true story of a girl who refused to die, and the Apache warrior who saw her worth when her own family saw only burden. The sun hung like a copper coin over the New Mexico desert on June 17, 1876, 15 miles east of Fort Sumner.
Beautiful, like
The
a
wagon
dream.
wheels kicked up dust that painted the air red as blood. Inside the
Yes.
wagon bed,
Let's go
14-year-old
home.
Margaret Brennan clutched the wooden sideboard, her knuckles white against the weathered oak. Her Uncle Silas had been silent for the last hour, and that silence carried more menace than any of his usual curses. The wagon lurched to a stop. Margaret looked around at the emptiness stretching in every direction. Nothing but sagebrush, scattered juniper, and the distant purple mountains that seemed impossibly far away. No homestead, no fort, no sister waiting to take her in, as Silas had promised. Her uncle climbed down from the driver's seat, his boots hitting the packed earth with a finality that made Margaret's stomach clench. He was a tall man, gone to seed with drink and bitterness. His face, so much like her father's face, had none of her father's kindness. 3 years of living under his roof had taught her to read every twitch of his weathered features, every shift in his cold gray eyes. Today, those eyes held nothing but cruel resolution. He reached into the wagon bed and grabbed her arm, yanking her forward with enough force to make her cry out. She stumbled as her feet hit the ground, catching herself just before she fell. Behind her, he threw her small bundle of possessions onto the dirt: a thin blanket, a dented canteen, perhaps 1/3 full, the small knife with the chipped blade that had been her father's, the silver locket containing the faded portraits of parents she barely remembered anymore. Margaret turned to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to ask why, but the word died in her throat. She already knew why. Her uncle's lips pulled back in something that might have been a smile on a kinder man's face. On Silas Brennan, it looked like a wound. "You're 14 now, girl," he said, his voice flat and final. "Old enough to make your own way. The land won't support two." Margaret found her voice, though it came out smaller than she wanted. "Uncle Silas, please. I can work harder. I can eat less. Please don't leave me here." He spat into the dust near her feet. "You're worthless. A burden I never asked for. Your father saddled me with you when he died, and I've fed you for 3 years out of Christian duty. That duty's done." He climbed back onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. Margaret felt panic rising in her chest like floodwater. She grabbed the wagon's side. "Uncle, the fort is still miles away. At least take me to the fort, please." Silas Brennan looked down at his niece for the last time. What Margaret saw in his eyes wasn't anger or even hatred. It was nothing. She had become nothing to him. "The desert can have you," he said. Then he cracked the reins hard, and the horses lurched forward. Margaret held on for 3 running steps before the wagon's speed tore her grip free. She fell to her knees in the dust, the coarse fabric of her worn dress scraping against the rocky ground. She watched the wagon disappear over the ridge ahead, the sound of wheels and hooves fading into the vast silence of the desert. Then she was alone, completely, utterly alone. For a long moment, Margaret Brennan knelt there in the dust, staring at the empty horizon where her uncle had vanished. Tears carved clean tracks through the dirt on her freckled cheeks. Her copper-colored hair, the same shade as her mother's, came loose from its braid and whipped across her face in the hot wind. She was going to die here. Her uncle had murdered her as surely as if he'd put a bullet through her heart. It would just take longer this way. But then something stirred beneath her grief and terror, something that had kept her alive through 3 years of her uncle's cruelty, something she had inherited from her father, who had crossed an ocean to build a new life, and from her mother, who had survived everything the frontier threw at her until the fever finally took her. Margaret Brennan refused to die. She stood up. Her legs shook, but they held her weight. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing dirt and tears together. Then she looked at what she had. The bundle of possessions lay scattered where Silas had thrown them. She gathered each item methodically, forcing her hands to stop trembling. The blanket was thin but whole. The canteen held perhaps enough water for 2 days if she was careful. The knife was small and chipped, but still sharp enough to cut. The locket held only memories, but memories had value too. She stood and surveyed the landscape with new eyes, trying to remember everything her mother had taught her during their brief years on the frontier. Her mother's voice seemed to echo in the hot wind. "Think, Margaret. Shade first, then water. You cannot survive this heat." To the west, perhaps 400 yards away, a scattered stand of juniper trees and large rocks offered the only promise of shelter before nightfall. The eastern sky had begun to take on that particular quality of light that meant evening was still hours away, but coming. Margaret tore a strip from her already ragged dress and wrapped it around her head to shield against the sun. It was something she had seen Mexican women do in town, and she sent up a silent prayer that it would help. Then she began walking toward the junipers. Each step stirred up dust that clung to her sweat-dampened skin. The coarse wool of her dress scratched against her sunburned shoulders. Her boots, already worn thin from 3 years of hard use, provided little protection against the sharp stones hidden in the sandy soil. But she kept moving, focusing on the trees ahead rather than the growing dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. What Margaret could not possibly know was that she was not as alone as she believed. High on a distant ridge, a figure sat motionless on horseback, watching. Cale Yazzie had been tracking deer through these canyons when he spotted the wagon. He had observed the entire scene with growing disbelief. He had seen many cruelties in his 28 years. He had watched his own people starved and driven onto reservations. He had seen settlers murdered for land, and settlers murdering for the same reason. He had witnessed the casual brutality that seemed to flourish in this harsh territory. But watching a man deliberately abandon a child to die in the desert struck him as a new depth of depravity. Cale could have ridden away. The white settlers and the Apache were enemies, after all. What happened between them was not his concern. He had learned long ago that walking between two worlds meant belonging fully to neither. But then he thought of Aita, his sister. She would have been about this girl's age if yellow fever had not taken her 2 winters ago. At least, that was what he told people when they asked. The truth was darker and more personal, involving a cavalry raid and a bullet meant for someone else. But the result was the same. Aita was gone. And now he watched another young girl, abandoned by her own blood, struggling toward inadequate shelter as the desert sun beat down with merciless intensity. Cale Yazzie clicked his tongue softly, and his horse began picking its way down the rocky slope. Margaret reached the juniper trees as the sun touched the western horizon. She collapsed against the largest rock, gasping for breath in the stifling air. Her throat felt like she had swallowed sand. She uncorked the canteen and allowed herself the smallest sip, knowing she had to make every drop last. As her breathing slowed, she began to notice details about her surroundings. Animal tracks in the dust near the base of the rock, the scattered droppings of coyotes, scratch marks on the tree bark where something with claws had passed through recently. She was not safe here, not for long. The realization brought a fresh wave of fear, but Margaret forced it down. Fear was useless. Fear was what her uncle had wanted. She would not give him the satisfaction, even if he would never know. She pulled out her father's knife and held it in her lap. The blade was barely 3 inches long, chipped near the point from where she had tried to pry open a rusted lock in her uncle's barn. It would do almost nothing against a pack of coyotes or a cougar, but it was all she had. That was when she heard it, the soft sound of hooves on stone. Margaret's hand tightened on the knife handle. She pushed herself upright, her back against the rock, her eyes scanning the deepening shadows. For a moment she saw nothing. Then a shape emerged from behind a boulder 20 paces away. A man on horseback. Not her uncle. This man sat differently in the saddle, with an ease that suggested he and the horse were one creature rather than two. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt. His long black hair was bound with a strip of red cloth. Even in the failing light, Margaret could see he was Apache. Every story her uncle had ever told her about Apache raiders flooded her mind. How they took captive women and children, how they tortured prisoners, how they were savages who knew nothing of mercy or civilization. Margaret Brennan drew herself up to her full height, which was not particularly impressive, and raised her father's chipped knife in a hand that trembled despite her best efforts. The Apache warrior made no move toward her. He simply sat on his horse, hands visible and empty, and regarded her with dark eyes that held something she had not expected to see. Understanding. When he spoke, his voice was calm and his English was perfect, with an accent that spoke of education rather than savagery. "Easy, flame-haired one. I watched the wagon man leave you. I am not here to harm." The shock of hearing him speak English nearly made Margaret drop her knife. She had expected grunts and gestures, not this clear, measured speech. "You speak English?" It was a stupid thing to say, but it was all her stunned mind could produce. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "Better than most white men, yes. Come. Night brings coyotes. I know shelter." Margaret's grip tightened on her pathetic knife. "How do I know you won't hurt me?" The Apache warrior's expression did not change, but something in his eyes softened slightly. "If I meant you harm, flame-haired one, you would already know it, and that knife would not save you." It was brutally honest, but Margaret recognized truth when she heard it. She had spent 3 years learning to distinguish between her uncle's lies and the rare moments when he spoke plainly. This man, whoever he was speaking plainly now. She looked at the darkening sky. She heard a coyote howl in the distance, answered by another, and then a third. She thought about spending the night pressed against this rock with nothing but a chipped blade between her and whatever came hunting in the darkness. Then she thought about her mother, who had always told her that pride was worth less than survival. Margaret lowered the knife. "If you mean to kill me, at least it will be quick." The Apache warrior nodded once, as if she had passed some kind of test. He extended his hand down toward her. "I am called Kyle Yazi. In your tongue, it means little warrior. What are you called?" "Margaret Brennan." She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was firm but careful, and he pulled her up behind him on the horse with surprising gentleness. "Most people call me Maggie." "Maggie." He said it carefully, as if testing the sound. "Hold on, Maggie Brennan. We have perhaps an hour's ride." She wrapped her arms around his waist, conscious of how thin she had become under her uncle's care. Her few possessions were tied in the blanket that Kyle had somehow retrieved while she was deciding whether to trust him. Everything she owned in the world now rested behind the saddle of an Apache warrior's horse. They rode west as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that might have been beautiful if Margaret had not been so exhausted and afraid. Cale did not speak, and she was grateful for the silence. She needed time to process what had happened. Abandoned by her uncle, rescued by an Apache, both impossibilities, yet both true. The hunting camp appeared as full darkness fell. It was built half into a rock outcropping, half from wood and brush, so well concealed that Margaret would have ridden past it without noticing. Cale dismounted and helped her down with the same careful gentleness he had shown before. "Sit there," he said, pointing to a spot near a ring of stones where a fire had been recently banked. "The coals are still warm." Margaret sank down onto the hard-packed earth, every muscle screaming with fatigue. She watched as Cale moved around the small camp with efficient, practiced movements. He took a water skin from his horse and brought it to her first, before seeing to his mount. "Drink," he said, slowly. "Your stomach is too empty for haste." The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the most wonderful thing Margaret had ever experienced. She forced herself to drink in small sips, as he had instructed. While she drank, Cale unsaddled his horse and rubbed the animal down with a handful of dry grass. Only when the horse was cared for did he turn his attention to building up the fire and retrieving food from a leather bag hung on the wall. He took strips of dried meat, broke one in half, and ate it himself before offering her the other piece. The gesture was not lost on Margaret. He was proving the food was safe. "Eat slowly," he said again. "You have been hungry too long. Fast eating will make you sick." The jerky was tough and salty, but Margaret's empty stomach rejoiced at the taste. She chewed carefully, making each bite last, while Cale settled across the fire from her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the flames. Margaret studied his face, trying to reconcile what she saw with everything she had been told about Apache warriors. He had strong features, weathered from years spent outdoors. His eyes held intelligence, and something else that took her a moment to identify. Sadness. Deep, old sadness that never quite left, even when he was not actively grieving. "Why did you help me?" The question came out before Margaret could stop it. Cale was quiet for so long, she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "I had a sister. She would be your age now. Yellow fever took her 2 winters past." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes again. "I'm sorry. Your uncle left you to die. I will not let that happen while I draw breath." The simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, broke something loose in Margaret's chest. She reached out across the fire, extending her hand toward him. Not offering a handshake, just reaching out in a gesture of connection. Cale looked at her hand for a moment, then reached across and briefly touched his fingers to hers. It was the lightest of contacts, but it felt like a promise. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. Cale nodded once and withdrew his hand. "Sleep now. We will talk more when the sun returns. You are safe here." He took a blanket and moved to the far side of the small shelter, giving her privacy and distance. The fire crackled between them, warm and bright against the vast darkness of the desert night. Margaret wrapped herself in her thin blanket and lay down on the hard ground. Every part of her body ached. Her feet throbbed where blisters had formed and broken. Her throat still felt raw despite the water. Her sunburned skin stung with every movement, but she was alive. Against all odds, against her uncle's intentions, against the desert itself, Margaret Brennan was alive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew that. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. She felt safe. As sleep finally claimed her, her last conscious thought was of the Apache warrior sitting across the fire. Kale Yazi, little warrior, the man who had saved her life for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. Margaret Brennan had lost everything today. Her home, her uncle, any illusion of family she might have clung to. But in losing everything, she had gained something unexpected. She had gained an ally. And in this harsh territory, where enemies outnumbered friends 100 to 1, that might be worth more than gold. The fire burned low as both the exhausted girl and the watching warrior finally found rest. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering and human kindness alike. But tomorrow, when the sun rose over the New Mexico desert, it would shine on a changed world. Margaret Brennan was no longer the abandoned child left to die. She was becoming something else, something stronger, something that would not break, no matter how hard the desert tried to grind her down. And 15 miles away in a dusty town, Silas Brennan was about to discover that leaving his niece to die had been the biggest mistake of his miserable life. Margaret woke to the smell of sage tea and the soft crackle of a cooking fire. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in her parents' cabin, that her mother was preparing breakfast while her father reviewed his lesson plans at the rough-hewn table. Then, reality crashed back with the weight of a falling boulder. Her parents were 3 years dead. Her uncle had left her to die. And she was in an Apache hunting camp with a man she had known for less than 12 hours. She sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. Her feet throbbed inside her worn boots. The morning sun slanted through the shelter's opening, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Cale knelt by the fire, tending a small pot. He glanced up as she stirred, his expression neutral but not unkind. "You slept deeply. That is good. The body heals in sleep." Margaret rubbed her eyes and looked around the camp in the morning light. What had seemed rough and primitive last night now revealed itself as surprisingly organized. Dried herbs hung from the wooden framework overhead. Clay pots and leather bags lined one wall. A few books, their covers worn and faded, sat stacked on a flat stone. Books, in an Apache hunting camp. Cale followed her gaze, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You are surprised. The savage knows how to read." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks. "I didn't mean to." "You did not say it, but you thought it. That is honest enough." He poured tea from the pot into a carved wooden cup and held it out to her. "Sage, for clarity of mind, as your people say. Or so I was taught at the mission school." Margaret accepted the cup carefully, their fingers not quite touching. The tea was hot and bitter, but not unpleasant. She took a small sip, then another. "The mission school?" "Santa Fe. 5 winters I spent there, learning the white man's words and numbers." His voice carried no particular emotion, but Margaret heard something beneath the flat tone. "They took our language, cut our hair, beat us when we spoke our mother tongue. They called it civilization." He stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. But I learned how to read your treaties before my people signed them, how to calculate when traders cheated with weights and measures, how to write letters that the white man's government could not ignore. He looked up at her then, and she saw something fierce in his dark eyes. Knowledge is a weapon, sometimes the only weapon we have. Margaret thought about that as she sipped her tea. Her father had said something similar once, before the fever took him. Education is the only true path from poverty, he had told her. Books cannot be stolen like gold. Knowledge cannot be taken like land. My father was a teacher, she said quietly. He believed in education, in knowledge. Then he was wise. Cale retrieved something from the pot and offered it to her on a flat stone. It looked like a cake made from ground seeds and dried berries. Your father, how did he die? Margaret's throat tightened. Fever, that's what they said. Both my parents, 3 years ago, in June. They got sick from the well water, or that's what Uncle Silas told everyone. She had not questioned it at the time. She had been 11 years old, drowning in grief, with no capacity to doubt the adults around her. But now, after yesterday, after her uncle had thrown her into the desert like unwanted rubbish, questions were beginning to form. Had it really been fever? Or had her uncle found a way to remove the obstacles standing between him and the Brennan homestead? Cale must have seen something change in her expression, because he leaned forward slightly. You think something different now. I don't know what I think. Margaret set down her teacup. All I know is that my uncle took me in after they died. For 3 years he treated me like a burden, worked me from dawn to dusk, fed me scraps, told me I was worthless. Her voice cracked slightly. And yesterday, he threw me away. Men who do such things have reasons. Bad reasons, but reasons. Cale stood and moved to the shelter's opening, looking out at the desert beyond. Your family's land, is it valuable? It's just 40 acres. Rocky soil, barely grows anything. The cabin my father built is small. We had a few chickens, a milk cow. Margaret shook her head. Nothing worth killing for. In this territory, land itself is worth killing for, and 40 acres in the right place. He turned back to face her. Where is this homestead? About 30 miles northwest of Fort Sumner, near where they're talking about putting the new railroad through. Margaret paused as a thought struck her. Uncle Silas had been meeting with a man from back east, a land speculator, I think, Clayton something. Cale's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. Clayton Vance. You know him? I know of him. He buys land along the proposed rail routes, buys it cheap from people desperate to sell, or from people who suddenly have no choice but to sell. His voice went cold. And sometimes from people who die unexpectedly, leaving their land to be claimed by others. The implication hung in the air between them, like smoke from the fire. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, something that transformed her grief into something harder and sharper. Rage. He killed them, she whispered. My uncle killed my parents. For land. For money from Clayton Vance. You have no proof, only suspicion. But it makes sense. Margaret stood, ignoring the protest from her blistered feet. It makes perfect sense. And then he kept me alive just long enough to make sure no one questioned his claim. Once I turned 14, once I was old enough that people might think I could survive on my own, he decided to get rid of me, too. Cale studied her for a long moment. If this is true, what would you do about it? Margaret Brennan, who had spent 3 years being silent and obedient and small, lifted her chin. I would make him answer for it. I would make him stand before a judge and admit what he did. I would take back what's mine. Something that might have been approval flickered across Cale's face. You are fierce, flame-haired one. But courage alone will not be enough. You need evidence and allies. Where do I find those? There is a place, 3 days northwest, Wheeler's Valley. A captain there stands for justice, even when the law does not. Will he help us? If we reach him, your uncle will search when you do not die as expected, and Clayton Vance has many men. Cale moved to his horse and began checking the saddle. We should leave soon. The desert is safer than the places where men gather, but we cannot stay here forever. Margaret watched him work, this Apache warrior who spoke better English than half the men in Fort Sumner. This man who had saved her life for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Really, not just because of your sister. Why risk yourself for a white girl you don't know?" Cale paused in his work. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I have walked between two worlds my whole life. Never fully Apache in the eyes of my people because I learned the white man's ways. Never fully accepted by whites because I was born Apache. I have seen both sides commit cruelties. Both sides speak of honor and practice treachery." He turned to face her fully. "Your uncle is a white man who abandoned his own blood. Clayton Vance is a white man who profits from death. The cavalry officers who led raids on my people were white men who spoke of civilization while burning villages. Not all white men are evil, but your skin does not make you good." He gestured toward her. "You are a child who survived the desert through quick thinking and determination, who drank muddy rainwater to stay alive, who did not panic when an Apache appeared, but made a choice based on logic rather than fear. Your character is not determined by your red hair or your Irish blood. It is determined by your actions." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. For the first time in 3 years, someone had seen her as a person rather than a burden or an inconvenience. "Thank you," she said quietly. Cale nodded once. "Come, we have far to travel before nightfall." They rode northwest through country that grew increasingly rugged as the morning progressed. Cale set a steady pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling. He stopped frequently to check their back trail, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Margaret learned to stay silent during these stops, understanding that her survival might depend on Cale's ability to spot danger before it spotted them. She used the time to observe the landscape, trying to memorize landmarks the way her father had taught her when they first came west. By midday, they had climbed into broken canyon country where red rock walls rose on either side and the path narrowed to barely wider than the horse. Cale dismounted and led the animal on foot through the tightest sections, and Margaret walked beside them, grateful for the chance to stretch her legs, despite the pain from her blistered feet. They were emerging from one such narrow passage when Cale suddenly froze. His hand went up in a gesture that needed no translation. "Stop. Silent. Now." Margaret obeyed instantly, pressing herself against the canyon wall. Cale moved forward in a crouch, peering around a boulder that blocked their view of the canyon ahead. After a moment, he retreated and gestured for Margaret to follow him back the way they had come. Once they were safely around a bend, he spoke in a whisper. "Riders. 4, maybe 5. Coming this way." "My uncle?" "Too far to tell, but we will not wait to find out." He looked up at the canyon walls. Can you climb?" Margaret followed his gaze. The walls were steep, but not vertical, with enough handholds and ledges to make ascent possible. For someone young and desperate, at least. "I can try." "Then try quickly." Cale took his rifle from the saddle and slung it across his back. Then he slapped his horse's rump, sending the animal trotting back down the canyon the way they had come. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the stone walls, growing fainter. "They will follow the horse," Cale explained, already moving to the base of the wall. "With luck, we will be above them before they realize their mistake. Come, I will help you." The climb was harder than Margaret expected. Her arms shook with effort. Her fingers scraped against rough stone. Twice she nearly fell, saved only by Cale's steady hand on her back, or his arm reaching down from above to pull her up. But they made it to a ledge perhaps 40 feet above the canyon floor, just as the riders came around the bend below. Margaret pressed herself flat against the rock, trying not to breathe too loudly. From their vantage point, she could see the men clearly. 5 riders, as Cale had guessed. 3 of them were rough-looking men she did not recognize, the kind of hard-faced individuals who hired out their guns to whoever paid best. But the other 2 she knew immediately. The well-dressed man on the fine horse was Clayton Vance. She had seen him twice when he visited her uncle, always arriving with a leather satchel and leaving with a satisfied smile. And the drunk, sweating man on the lesser horse was Silas Brennan. Her uncle looked terrible. His face was flushed and puffy. His hands trembled as he clutched the reins. When he spoke, his voice carried up to their hiding place with perfect clarity. "I'm telling you, Vance, she's dead. No one survives 2 days in that desert with half a canteen of water." Clayton Vance's response was cold and measured. "She better be, Brennan. If that girl surfaces before the land transfer goes through, this whole arrangement falls apart. I paid you $200 to handle the problem. You assured me it was handled." "It is handled. She's dead. Dead as her fool parents." "You said typhoid took them." Silas laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "It did. The tainted well just needed help getting tainted." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Beside her, Cale had gone very still, his dark eyes fixed on the men below. Vance's voice cut through the canyon air like a blade. "Never admit that again. Not to me, not to anyone. The paperwork shows natural death. That's all anyone needs to know." "Fine, fine. But the girl is handled, I swear it." "She better be, because if she's not, if someone finds her and brings her back, you'll hang. And I'll make sure you hang alone." Vance pulled his horse around. "Find that horse. Make sure it's not hers. I want to see a body before I feel confident about this." The 5 riders moved on, following the sound of Cale's horse. Their voices faded into the distance. Margaret remained frozen against the rock, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The words she had just heard echoed in her mind, each one a nail in the coffin of any doubt she might have harbored. Her uncle had murdered her parents, had poisoned the well that killed them, had collected $200 from Clayton Vance for the privilege. And then, when she became old enough to potentially claim her inheritance, he had tried to murder her too. Cale's hand on her shoulder brought her back to the present. "We must move," he said quietly. "They will discover the horse soon and turn back." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They climbed higher, finding a game trail that led along the canyon rim toward the northwest. The going was rough and exposed, but it kept them off the canyon floor, where Vance's men would be searching. They walked for hours in silence. Margaret's mind churned with what she had heard. with the casual way her uncle had admitted to murder, with Clayton Vance's cold calculations. These were men who saw human lives as obstacles to be removed, as numbers in a ledger to be balanced. And she had been marked for removal. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally stopped to rest. Cale found a sheltered spot among the rocks where they could see in all directions, but remained hidden from casual observation. Margaret sank down onto a flat boulder, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Cale offered her water, and she drank gratefully. "You heard," she said finally. It was not a question. "I heard. He killed them. My uncle killed my parents." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm, too flat. "He poisoned the well and watched them die." "Yes." "And he tried to kill me." "Yes." Margaret looked up at Cale, her green eyes blazing with something that was no longer grief or fear, but pure, focused rage. "I want him to pay. I want them both to pay. Not just dead. I want them to stand in front of everyone and admit what they did. I want people to know." Cale regarded her steadily. "That will be harder than killing them. Harder and more dangerous." "I don't care." "You should care. Men like Vance have power, money, connections that reach to the territorial governor. They will fight to protect themselves." "Let them fight." Margaret stood, despite her exhaustion, despite her blistered feet and sunburned skin, and 3 years of being told she was worthless. "I'm tired of being quiet. I'm tired of being invisible. My parents died, and no one questioned it. I was going to die, and no one would have questioned that either. Someone has to speak for us. Someone has to tell the truth." Cale was silent for a long moment, studying her face. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well. We go to Wheeler's Valley. We find allies. We gather evidence. And we make them answer for their crimes." "You'll help me? Even though it will be dangerous?" "I have walked dangerous paths before." He turned to look out at the desert, stretching away to the west. "And you remind me that some things are worth the risk. Justice is one of those things." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. This Apache warrior, who owed her nothing, who had every reason to leave her to her fate, had instead chosen to stand beside her, had chosen to help her fight an impossible battle against men more powerful than either of them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Cale glanced back at her, and for the first time since they met, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it transformed his face. "You survived the desert, Maggie Brennan. That was the hard part. Everything else is just walking." They made camp as darkness fell, sharing the last of Cale's dried meat and discussing their plans in low voices. 3 more days to Wheeler's Valley. 3 more days of staying ahead of Vance's men and avoiding populated areas where questions might be asked. 3 more days, and then the real fight would begin. As Margaret lay down to sleep that night, wrapped in her thin blanket under a sky thick with stars, she thought about her parents, about her father who believed in education, and her mother who practiced the old healing arts, about how they had come west, seeking opportunity, and found death instead. But their daughter had survived, and she would make sure their deaths meant something. She would make sure justice was served, even if it cost her everything she had left. The morning of their second day brought a dust devil spinning across the desert floor like a dancing ghost. Margaret watched it from their makeshift camp, her body still aching from yesterday's climb and long walk. Cale had woken before dawn, as he seemed to always do, and had already scouted their path forward. When he returned, his expression was troubled. "We have a problem," he said, without preamble. "There are more riders now, at least 8, spread in a search pattern. They know you survived." Margaret's stomach tightened. "How could they know?" "Your uncle's horse. They found it grazing near water with empty saddle. No body nearby. They are smart enough to realize you had help." Cale knelt and drew lines in the dust with his finger, creating a rough map. "We can no longer travel the main trails. We must go higher, through the passes. It will be harder but safer." "How much harder?" Cale looked at her feet, still wrapped in makeshift bandages he had fashioned from strips of his own shirt. "Hard enough, but I think you are strong enough." Margaret thought about the alternative, about being caught by her uncle and Clayton Vance's hired guns, about disappearing into the desert for real this time, with no one to speak for her or her parents. "Then we go higher," she said. They climbed for hours through terrain that seemed designed to break the human spirit. Loose scree shifted under their feet. Thorny bushes grabbed at their clothes. The sun beat down with relentless fury, turning every rock into a burning coal. But Cale moved with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains, and Margaret followed, matching his pace through sheer stubbornness. She fell twice, scraping her palms bloody on the rough stone. Each time she picked herself up without complaint and kept moving. By late afternoon, they had reached a high saddle between 2 peaks. The view stretched for miles in every direction, revealing the full majesty and menace of the New Mexico territory. To the east, the desert they had crossed looked like an ocean of sand and stone. To the west, more mountains rose in purple ridges, and below them, in a hidden valley that could not be seen from any normal approach, lay Wheeler's Valley. Margaret stared at it in wonder. From their vantage point, she could see cultivated fields, scattered buildings of different styles, and people moving about their daily tasks. It looked like a settlement, but unlike any she had seen before. Adobe structures sat beside log cabins. What appeared to be a Navajo hogan stood near a building that might have been Chinese in design. "Is that it?" she asked. "That is Wheeler's sanctuary, home to those who have nowhere else." Cale pointed to a thin column of smoke rising from the valley floor. "But we cannot simply walk in. We must be seen first, evaluated. Wheeler is cautious. He has to be." As if summoned by Cale's words, 3 riders emerged from the tree line below, heading up the mountain toward their position. They moved with purpose, but not hostility, spreading out in a formation that suggested military training. "Wheeler's patrol," Cale said. "They watch all approaches. Stay close to me and let me speak first." The riders reached them within 20 minutes. The lead rider was a Mexican man, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a quick smile and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He reined in his horse and looked from Cale to Margaret with open curiosity. "Cale Yazi," the man said, his accent making music of the words. "You crazy Apache. What brings you to Wheeler's land with a very young white girl? This does not look good, amigo." "Miguel Santos." Cale's tone held warmth despite the seriousness of the situation. "The girl is Margaret Brennan. Someone is trying to kill her for her family's land." Miguel's smile faded. "Land. Always land." He turned his attention to Margaret, his expression softening. "You are safe now, Pequeña. Wheeler does not let innocent blood spill." Margaret found her voice. "Can he help us prove murder?" Miguel whistled low. "Murder? Dios mío, you do not ask small favors." He gestured down the mountain. "Come, the captain will want to hear this story. And you, Nina, you look like you need food and rest." As they descended into the valley, Miguel rode beside them, his earlier levity giving way to something more thoughtful. "How long have you been running?" he asked Margaret. 3 days, since my uncle left me in the desert to die. Your uncle. Miguel shook his head. Family should protect, not harm. This is a truth Wheeler understands very well. He has built this place for those betrayed by family, by government, by the very people who should have protected them. The valley revealed itself gradually as they descended. What had looked unified from above now showed itself as a patchwork of different cultures living side by side. Margaret saw Mexican women hanging laundry next to Apache women grinding corn. A Chinese man tended an elaborate garden, while Navajo children played nearby. A white woman in practical men's clothing repaired a fence alongside a man whose mixed heritage was written in his features. It should not have worked. Everything Margaret had been taught said these different peoples could not coexist, that the natural order demanded separation. But here they were, living and working together as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Miguel noticed her staring. Strange, yes? But good strange. Here, we judge by character, not color, by actions, not ancestry. He grinned. Although the food arguments can get very loud, everyone believes their grandmother's recipes are sacred. Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. The first real smile in 3 years. They rode into the heart of the settlement, where a large building that might have once been a military barracks served as a central meeting place. A man emerged as they approached, and Margaret knew immediately this was Captain Isaiah Wheeler. He was perhaps in his mid-50s, with gray streaked hair worn longer than military regulation would have allowed. His left sleeve was pinned at the shoulder, the arm lost to some past battle. But his eyes were sharp and commanding, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Those eyes assessed Margaret and Cale with a single sweeping glance that seemed to see everything. Cale, Wheeler said, his voice deep and measured. Miguel says you bring trouble. I bring a conspiracy, Captain. Murder, attempted murder, and land fraud involving the railroad. Wheeler's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Interest, perhaps, or recognition. That's 3 federal crimes. Come inside. Tell me everything. The interior of the building was surprisingly comfortable. Maps covered one wall, showing the territory in careful detail. A large table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Books lined shelves, their spines showing titles on law, medicine, agriculture, and history. Wheeler gestured for them to sit. A woman appeared with water and bread, setting them before Margaret with a gentle smile, before disappearing again. Margaret drank deeply, suddenly aware of how thirsty the climb had made her. When she set down the cup, Wheeler was watching her with those penetrating eyes. Tell me your story, Miss Brennan, from the beginning. So Margaret told him. About her parents dying 3 years ago. About living with her uncle. About his cruelty and neglect. About being driven into the desert and left to die. About Cale finding her and protecting her. And finally about overhearing her uncle's confession that he had poisoned the well that killed her parents. That Clayton Vance had paid him $200 to do it. Wheeler listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and was silent for a long moment. Clayton Vance, he said finally. I know that name. He's been buying up land along the proposed Santa Fe Railroad route, pushing out homesteaders by any means necessary. Can you help us prove what he did? Margaret asked. I can, but we'll need more than your word against his. We'll need a U.S. Marshal, a judge willing to hear the case, and witnesses. Wheeler's gaze was steady. That means going to Fort Sumner. That means walking into the viper's nest. I'll do it. You're 14 years old. I'm old enough to testify, old enough to claim my inheritance, old enough to demand justice for my parents. Margaret straightened in her chair.
And I'm old enough to have survived the desert when my uncle wanted me dead. That should count for something.
Wheeler's mouth twitched in what might have been approval. It counts for a great deal, actually. Very well. We'll need 3 days to prepare, to contact the marshal, to gather what evidence we can, to train you for what's ahead. Train me? Courtrooms are battlefields, Miss Brennan. And you'll be walking into one where your enemy has money, power, and no conscience about lying. You need to be ready. A young woman entered then, tall and confident, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore men's trousers and a work shirt, and moved with an economy of motion that suggested purpose in everything she did. "This is my daughter, Sarah," Wheeler said. "She'll help you prepare." Sarah Wheeler studied Margaret with eyes as sharp as her father's. "You've been through hell," she said bluntly, "but hell's not done with you yet." Sarah knew every trick, every way to twist words, every method of making a witness doubt themselves. But Margaret learned. She learned to breathe through her anger, to answer questions with precision, to hold her ground when challenged. She learned to use silence as a weapon, to let her stillness speak when words might fail. In the evenings, Elena Cortez, the settlement's unofficial leader among the Mexican families, taught her other lessons. How to present herself with dignity, how to move with confidence even when afraid, how to accept help without feeling diminished by it. "You are not alone," Elena said one evening as she helped Margaret mend her tattered dress. "That is the most important lesson. Your uncle wanted you to feel alone, helpless, worthless. But look around you. All these people, they stand with you, not because they know you, but because they know injustice." Cale remained nearby during those 3 days, a quiet presence that nevertheless felt essential. He spoke little, but Margaret found comfort in his watchfulness. Several times she caught him in conversation with Miguel or Wheeler, their heads bent together over maps or legal documents. On the third evening, Wheeler called them all together in the main hall. A telegraph message had arrived from Fort Sumner. Marshal Tom Garrett was willing to hear their case. Judge Harrison Cole had agreed to convene a hearing. They would leave at dawn. "Vance will know we're coming the moment we enter Fort Sumner," Wheeler warned. "He has eyes everywhere, and he'll fight. Men like him don't surrender power easily." "Let him fight," Margaret said. "I'm ready." Sarah gave her an appraising look. "You know, I think you actually are." That night, the community gathered for a ceremony of sorts. Thomas Rain, a Navajo elder with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment, stood before the assembled group. "Young one who was left behind," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "You carry the hopes of all who have been cast out. Speak truth with clear voice. The spirits walk with you." People came forward then, one by one, offering gifts. Elena gave her an embroidered shawl for dignity. A Chinese gardener named Chen Wei gave her a pouch of dried tea for calm. Miguel pressed a small carved wooden cross into her hand for luck. Sarah brought pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother for courage. Margaret accepted each gift with tears streaming down her face. These people, who had known her for only 3 days, were giving her pieces of themselves, armor for the battle ahead. Cale was the last to approach. He held something in his closed hand, and when he opened it, Margaret saw a carved wooden hawk, its wings spread in flight, attached to a leather cord. "Among my people," he said quietly, "the hawk represents clear vision and protection.
It sees both what is close and what is far. It sees truth when others see only shadows." He placed the cord around her neck, the hawk settling against her heart. "You are no longer the girl your uncle left to die. You are warrior. Remember that when they try to make you small again." Margaret touched the carved hawk, feeling its smooth edges, its surprising weight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Cale nodded once, then stepped back. But his eyes held a promise. He would be there beside her. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. As the gathering dispersed and people returned to their homes, Margaret stood looking up at the stars scattered across the endless sky. Somewhere out there, her uncle and Clayton Vance were sleeping peacefully, confident in their power, certain they had eliminated any threat to their plans. They had no idea what was coming for them. A 14-year-old girl with copper hair and green eyes full of fire. A girl who had survived abandonment, desert, and betrayal. A girl who had found allies in the most unexpected places and learned that family was not defined by blood, but by who stood beside you when darkness came. Margaret Brennan had been left to die, but she had chosen to live. And now she was going to make them pay for every moment of suffering they had caused. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent as always. But tomorrow, when the sun rose over Wheeler's Valley, it would shine on a girl transformed, not a victim anymore, not helpless or worthless or alone. A truth speaker, a justice seeker, a warrior in her own right. And she was ready for war. Dawn broke cold over Wheeler's Valley. 3 days had passed since Marshal Garrett's arrival, 3 days of preparation and planning. Now, as the community gathered to see them off, Margaret felt the weight of what lay ahead. The ride to Fort Sumner took 2 full days, and every mile brought them closer to confrontation. The group traveling from Wheeler's Valley was small but purposeful. Captain Wheeler led, his one arm handling the reins with the ease of long practice. Marshal Tom Garrett had arrived the evening before their departure, a weathered man of 48 with a U.S. Marshal's badge pinned to his vest and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to harbor any illusions about human nature. Beside the Marshal rode Deputy Frank Morris, younger and noticeably uncomfortable. Margaret had noticed how the deputy's gaze kept sliding away from direct eye contact, how his hands fidgeted with his reins. There was a story there, she thought, a man wrestling with his conscience. Sarah Wheeler rode close to Margaret, occasionally reaching over to adjust the shawl Elena had given her, or to offer water from a canteen. Cale and Miguel ranged ahead and behind, scouts ensuring their approach would not be ambushed. As Fort Sumner's buildings appeared on the horizon, Margaret felt her stomach twist. Somewhere in that collection of wooden structures and dusty streets, her uncle was going about his business, confident he had buried his crime along with his niece. Somewhere in there, Clayton Vance was calculating profits from stolen land, certain his money and influence made him untouchable. They were about to learn otherwise. Marshal Garrett called a halt just outside the town. "We do this carefully," he said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Miss Brennan and Miss Wheeler will proceed to the boarding house. Book rooms as if you're travelers passing through. Cale and Miguel will watch from the livery stable. Captain Wheeler and I will present ourselves at the fort headquarters and request Judge Cole convene a hearing." "What about Vance?" Margaret asked.
"Won't he know the moment we arrive?" "He'll know within the hour," Garrett admitted. But by then, the machinery of law will already be in motion. Once I file formal charges with the judge, Vance can't simply make you disappear. Too many official eyes will be watching. And my uncle? We'll bring him in for questioning once we have the judge's order. With any luck, Silas will be too drunk to realize the trap until it's already sprung. They entered Fort Sumner as the afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold. The town was bigger than Margaret remembered from her one previous visit. The railroad speculation had brought an influx of people, all hoping to profit from the coming boom. New buildings stood half-finished. The saloon did brisk business even at this early hour. Margaret and Sarah dismounted at the boarding house, a two-story structure that had seen better days but maintained an air of respectability. The proprietress, Mrs. Ruth Patterson, greeted them with the wariness of someone who had learned to assess strangers quickly. "Rooms for the night," Sarah said smoothly. "My young cousin and I are passing through on our way to Santa Fe." Mrs. Patterson's eyes lingered on Margaret's copper hair and the expensive shawl that seemed at odds with her otherwise modest appearance. But frontier hospitality demanded she ask no questions. $2 for the night, suppers at 6. As they climbed the stairs to their assigned room, Margaret heard voices from the dining room below. One of them froze the blood in her veins. Her uncle, Silas Brennan, holding court with several other men, his voice thick with whiskey and false bonhomie. Sarah felt Margaret stiffen and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Not yet," she whispered. "Tomorrow, in the courthouse, with the law watching. That's when you face him." In their small room, Sarah helped Margaret prepare for what lay ahead. They had brought one good dress from Wheeler's Valley, dark blue calico that made Margaret look older than her 14 years. Sarah pinned up Margaret's copper hair in a style that was severe but dignified. "Remember what I taught you," Sarah said as she worked. "Stand straight. Speak clearly. Look them in the eye. You're not asking for justice. You're demanding it. What if they don't believe me? Some won't. Some never will. But you're not trying to convince everyone. You only need to convince the judge. And good men like Harrison Cole, they recognize truth when they hear it, especially when it comes from someone brave enough to speak it." A knock at the door made them both tense. Sarah moved to answer it, positioning herself between Margaret and whoever stood outside. It was Deputy Morris. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly. "Miss Brennan," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I need to tell you something. Before tomorrow. Before the hearing." "Come in," Sarah said, though her tone held warning. Morris entered, removing his hat and clutching it like a lifeline. He looked at Margaret with something that might have been shame. "I've been taking money from Clayton Vance. Have been for near 2 years now. $50 a month to look the other way when homesteaders got pressured to sell. To make sure certain property disputes got decided in his favor." Margaret felt anger rise in her chest. "You knew. You knew he was stealing land." "I knew, and I did nothing. Worse than nothing. I helped." Morris's voice cracked. "But I didn't know about murder. I swear I didn't know he'd gone that far. When Marshal Garrett told me what you heard, what your uncle confessed to..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I can't live with that. I won't live with that." "What are you saying?" Sarah asked. "I'm saying I'll testify. About the bribes. About seeing Vance pay your uncle $200 3 days before you disappeared. About the conversation I overheard, where Vance told the sheriff not to bother looking for you because you'd probably just run off." Morris finally met Margaret's eyes. "I can't give you back your parents, but I can help make sure their killers face justice." Margaret studied the deputy's face, seeing genuine remorse there. He was a weak man, easily corrupted, but not evil. Not beyond redemption. Why now? Why help us now? Because my own daughter is 14, Morris said quietly. Same age as you. And thinking about someone leaving her in the desert to die. His voice broke completely. I have to make this right, however I can. After Morris left, Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the darkening street below. Lanterns were being lit in windows. Somewhere, a piano played in the saloon. Life continuing as normal, while justice prepared to disrupt it. Do you believe him? She asked Sarah. I believe his guilt is real. Whether that translates to courage when he's actually on the witness stand, Sarah shrugged. We'll find out tomorrow. Morning came too quickly and too slowly. Margaret dressed with care, her hands steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. The hearing was set for noon, giving Marshal Garrett time to formally arrest Silas Brennan and serve Clayton Vance with a summons to appear. The courthouse was the newest building in Fort Sumner, constructed with railroad money in anticipation of the town's growth. Inside, the air was close and warm. Wooden benches filled most of the space, with a raised platform at the front where Judge Harrison Cole would preside. Margaret took her seat beside Marshal Garrett, aware of every eye in the room, tracking her movement. The townspeople had turned out in force, drawn by rumors of scandal and murder charges against one of their prominent citizens. Then Silas Brennan was led in by 2 deputies, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her uncle looked smaller than she remembered, diminished somehow. His face was gray beneath the sunburn, his eyes bloodshot and darting. When his gaze found her, sitting alive and defiant in the front row, the color drained completely from his features. For a long moment, he simply stared, his mouth working soundlessly. Then he lunged toward her with a roar that might have been rage or terror or both. The deputies caught him, wrestled him back, but the damage was done. Everyone in that courtroom had seen Silas Brennan's reaction to his supposedly dead niece. Shock, yes, but also guilt written so plainly across his face that even the blind could have read it. Clayton Vance entered moments later, impeccably dressed and radiating confidence. He was perhaps 40, with silver threading his dark hair, and the kind of smooth good looks that inspired trust in the unwary. His eyes swept the courtroom, noted Margaret's presence with barely a flicker, and settled on Judge Cole with the assurance of a man who believed money could buy any verdict. Judge Harrison Cole took his seat behind the bench. He was 58 years old, with iron-gray hair and a face carved by 30 years of frontier law. He surveyed the packed courtroom with stern disapproval. "This is a hearing, not a circus," he announced. "Anyone who cannot maintain proper decorum will be removed. That includes you, Mr. Brennan." Silas had been forced back into his seat, but he continued to stare at Margaret with wild eyes. "Marshal Garrett," Cole continued, "present your charges." Garrett stood, and his voice carried to every corner of the room. "Your Honor, the United States government charges Silas Brennan with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Samuel and Mary Brennan 3 years past. We further charge both Silas Brennan and Clayton Vance with conspiracy to commit murder and conspiracy to commit fraud in matters concerning railroad land acquisition." The courtroom erupted. Cole's gavel came down like a gunshot. "Order! I will have order!" The noise subsided to urgent whispers. Vance's attorney, a sleek man named Cornelius Black, was already on his feet. "Your Honor, these charges are outrageous. My client is a respected businessman. Silas Brennan is a hard-working farmer. And the supposed victim making these accusations is a troubled child with a history of wild imagination. The supposed victim is very much alive, Mr. Black, Cole said dryly, which rather suggests someone failed in their attempt to make her otherwise. Marshal, call your first witness. Dr. Henry Whitmore. An older man took the stand, his medical bag still in hand, as if he had come directly from a patient. He was sworn in, and Garrett began his questioning. Dr.
Whitmore, you treated Samuel and Mary Brennan in their final illness.
I did. June of 1873. Severe vomiting, abdominal pain, dehydration, consistent with typhoid fever from contaminated water. But you noted something unusual. Whitmore hesitated, then reached into his bag and withdrew a worn leather journal. I noted metallic taste on the tongue, burning sensation in the throat and stomach, symptoms that could suggest arsenicum poisoning in addition to bacterial infection. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Garrett pressed forward. Did you share these suspicions? I mentioned them to the sheriff at the time. He said the well had been tested and found clean. Tested by whom? By Silas Brennan, several weeks after the deaths. Several weeks. Time enough for any poison to be washed away by rain or diluted by use? Yes, Whitmore admitted. Time enough for that. Cornelius Black rose for cross-examination, his smile predatory. Doctor. Whitmore, how many cases of arsenic poisoning have you personally diagnosed and treated? None confirmed. None confirmed. So your suspicion is based on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience? Medical school training and 20 years of practice give me sufficient foundation to recognize unusual symptoms. Or to imagine them where none exist? Black let the question hang. No further questions. Marshal Garrett called Deputy Morris next. The young deputy took the stand with visible reluctance, his hands gripping the railing as if it were the only solid thing in a tilting world. Deputy Morris, you have information relevant to this case? I do, sir. Morris's voice was barely audible. Speak up, deputy, Judge Cole ordered. Morris straightened his shoulders. I was on Clayton Vance's payroll. $50 a month to influence property disputes and ignore certain irregularities in land transactions. The courtroom exploded again. This time it took Cole several strikes of the gavel to restore order. Continue, Garrett said when silence returned. 3 days before Margaret Brennan disappeared, I witnessed Mr. Vance pay Silas Brennan $200. I heard Mr. Vance say, and I quote, "Finish it this time." I didn't understand what he meant until Miss Brennan turned up alive with stories of being abandoned in the desert. Vance was on his feet. This is a lie, a desperate attempt by a corrupt deputy to save his own skin. Mr. Vance, sit down, Cole ordered. You'll have your chance to speak. But the damage was done. The courtroom buzzed with scandal. A deputy admitting to corruption. Cash payments between Vance and Brennan. The pieces were coming together, and the picture they formed was damning. Black tried to salvage the situation during cross-examination. Deputy Morris, you're testifying in exchange for leniency regarding your own crimes, are you not? Marshal Garrett has promised nothing. I'm testifying because it's right. Or because you're saving yourself by sacrificing others. I'm saving myself by telling the truth. Finally. The afternoon wore on, witness after witness building the case. Then, as the light began to fade outside the courthouse windows, Marshal Garrett stood once more. Your Honor, I call Margaret Brennan to testify." Margaret rose on legs that felt like water. Sarah gave her hand a squeeze. Cale, standing at the back of the courtroom, met her eyes and nodded once. She walked to the witness stand, feeling every eye upon her, was sworn in with a hand that did not shake, took her seat and faced the crowded room with her chin raised and her shoulders straight. Marshal Garrett's first question was simple. "State your name and age for the record." "Margaret Brennan. I'm 14 years old." "Tell us what happened on June 17th of this year." Margaret took a breath. Then she began to speak. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the courtroom. She told them about her uncle driving her into the desert, about his final words as he left her to die, about the 3 days that followed, and about what she had overheard when her uncle and Clayton Vance thought no one was listening. He said, "The well needed help getting tainted," Margaret reported, her eyes fixed on Silas. "He laughed when he said it, laughed about poisoning the water that killed my parents." Silas made a sound like a wounded animal. Vance put a restraining hand on his arm, but the damage showed on Silas's face. Guilt, terror, the look of a man watching his carefully constructed lies collapse. Cornelius Black approached for a cross-examination, like a shark scenting blood. "Miss Brennan, Reverend Patterson has testified that you were prone to wild stories as a child, that you claimed to talk to animals, to see spirits." "I told stories about nature," Margaret said calmly. "About birds and seasons. My father was a naturalist. He taught me to observe the world carefully, or to let imagination run away with observation." Black smiled. "You've spent time with an Apache warrior, a renegade who lives outside civilized society. Might he have influenced these accusations, put words in your mouth?" Margaret felt anger flash through her, hot and righteous. "Cale Yazzie saved my life when my own blood tried to end it. He's shown me more honor than any white man I've known except my father. And nobody puts words in my mouth, Mr. Black. These are my words, my truth, my parents' truth." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Black tried several more angles, but Margaret deflected each one with the poise Sarah had taught her, and the determination forged in the desert. Finally, he gave up. No further questions. Judge Cole looked at Margaret for a long moment. "You may step down, Miss Brennan." But before she could move, Silas Brennan lurched to his feet. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't let her take the blame for this. I can't." "Silas, sit down," Vance hissed. But his associate was beyond listening. "It was supposed to be clean," Silas continued, words tumbling out in a rush. "Vance gave me the arsenic, said it would look like typhoid if we used it right, said we'd both be rich from the land deal. But then Margaret survived and kept surviving, and I had to—" He looked at his niece with eyes full of tears and terror. "I'm sorry. God forgive me. I'm sorry." The confession hung in the air like gun smoke. Clayton Vance was already moving toward the door, but Miguel and Cale blocked his path, and Marshal Garrett's hand was on his gun. "Arrest them both," Judge Cole ordered. "We'll reconvene tomorrow for formal sentencing." As deputies surrounded Vance and Silas, Margaret remained in the witness stand, watching justice finally arrive after 3 long years. Her hands gripped the wooden railing, keeping her upright as relief and grief warred within her. She had done it. She had spoken truth in the face of power, and truth had won. Her parents could rest now. Their deaths would not go unanswered. Their killer would face the consequences he had tried so desperately to escape. Sarah was there suddenly, helping her down from the stand, and then Captain Wheeler and Cale were surrounding her,
a wall of protection against the chaos of the courtroom. People pressed close, wanting to shake her hand, to touch her sleeve, to assure themselves that this impossible girl was real. Margaret Brennan, who had been left to die, had returned to speak for the dead, and in speaking, she had brought down men who thought themselves beyond the reach of frontier justice. The sun was setting as they emerged from the courthouse, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Tomorrow would bring formal sentencing. Tomorrow would bring closure.
But tonight, Margaret could finally breathe. The courtroom was already packed when Judge Harrison Cole took his seat the following morning. Word of yesterday's dramatic confession had spread through Fort Sumner like wildfire, drawing curious onlookers from every corner of the territory. They came to see justice delivered, to witness the fall of men who had thought themselves above the law. Margaret sat in the front row between Sarah Wheeler and Marshall Garrett. She had barely slept, her mind replaying her uncle's breakdown, his tearful confession. Part of her had felt a strange pity for Silas Brennan in that moment. But then she remembered her mother's face, her father's gentle voice, the 3 years of cruelty that had followed their deaths. Pity died quickly in the face of such memories. Silas was brought in first, shackled and gray-faced. The night in jail had stripped away what remained of his bluster. He looked like what he was, a broken man who had sold his soul for $200 and lost everything in the bargain. Clayton Vance entered next, and the contrast was striking. Where Silas looked defeated, Vance radiated cold fury. His expensive suit was immaculate. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly groomed, but his eyes held the rage of a man unaccustomed to losing, and they fixed on Margaret with undisguised hatred. Margaret met that gaze without flinching. She had faced the desert, had survived abandonment and pursuit. One angry man's stare held no power over her anymore. Judge Cole surveyed the courtroom with stern authority. Yesterday, this court heard testimony regarding the murders of Samuel and Mary Brennan and the attempted murder of their daughter Margaret. Silas Brennan confessed to poisoning his brother and sister-in-law at the instigation of Clayton Vance. The evidence, combined with that confession, leaves no doubt as to guilt. He paused, letting his words settle over the assembled crowd. I have presided over this court for 15 years. I have seen claim disputes, cattle rustling, even murder. But I have never seen a case that so clearly revealed the corruption that can fester when greed disguises itself as progress. Vance's attorney rose. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence. Mr. Brennan's confession is the raving of a disturbed man trying to deflect blame. Mr. Black, your client paid a man to murder his own brother. We have a witness who saw the payment. We have the deputy who facilitated the subsequent cover-up. We have the victim herself who overheard your client discussing the crime. Cole's voice was ice. Sit down. Black sat. Cole turned his attention to the prisoners. Silas Brennan, stand. Silas rose on unsteady legs, his shackles rattling. You murdered your brother and his wife for money. You orphaned a child, then spent 3 years making her life a misery before attempting to murder her as well. You have confessed to these crimes before witnesses. Cole's expression held no mercy. I sentence you to death by hanging. Sentence to be carried out 1 week hence. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Silas swayed, and for a moment Margaret thought he might faint. But he remained standing, staring at nothing. Clayton Vance, stand. Vance rose with rigid dignity, his face a mask of controlled fury. You orchestrated this entire conspiracy. You provided the means and the motive for murder. You corrupted law officers and manipulated land sales through intimidation and death. While I cannot prove you pulled the trigger or poured the poison yourself, you are as guilty as if you had. Cole leaned forward. I sentence you to 20 years hard labor at the territorial prison. All your property and assets are hereby seized and will be sold, with proceeds going first to restitution for your victims. This is a travesty, Vance said, his voice tight with rage. You're destroying a legitimate businessman on the word of a child and a corrupt deputy. I'm delivering justice to a murderer who hid behind respectability, Cole shot back. And I'm ensuring that the Brennan homestead returns to its rightful owner. He looked at Margaret. Miss Brennan, upon your 16th birthday, full title to your family's property will be transferred to you. Until then, Captain Wheeler has agreed to serve as trustee. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. Her parents' land, the home they had built. It would be hers again. But before she could fully process this, Vance turned to her with a smile that held no warmth, only cold promise. Enjoy your victory, girl, but remember this, the railroad will still come. Progress doesn't stop for one child's revenge. Men like me, we always find a way. Marshal Garrett's hand moved to his gun, but Cale was faster, stepping between Vance and Margaret with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. And men like you always fall, he said quietly. Sometimes the fall takes years, sometimes it takes days, but it always comes. Deputies moved in, separating them. Vance was led away, still radiating defiance. Silas followed, his head down, a man already dead inside. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret remained seated. The weight of the past weeks, the past 3 years, seemed to settle on her shoulders all at once. She had won. Justice had been served. Her parents could rest in peace. So why did she feel so empty? Sarah's hand found hers. It's all right to feel what you're feeling. Justice doesn't erase the pain. It just gives it meaning. I thought I'd feel different, Margaret whispered. I thought once he was convicted, once he admitted what he did, I'd feel, I don't know, complete somehow. Grief doesn't work that way, Wheeler said, settling into the bench beside them. You've been running on determination and anger for weeks now. But anger burns out eventually. What's left is the hole where your parents used to be.
That hole doesn't fill just because the man who created it is punished. Margaret nodded slowly, understanding the truth of his words. The courtroom had delivered justice, but it could not deliver her mother's embrace or her father's gentle wisdom. Those were gone forever, and no verdict could change that. What do I do now? She asked. You live, Wheeler said simply. You take back what's yours. You become the person your parents hoped you'd be. That's the best revenge against men like Vance. Not just surviving, but thriving. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself caught in a strange limbo. The formal machinery of law ground forward with inexorable slowness. Papers were filed, property was assessed. Marshal Garrett interviewed her twice more, ensuring every detail was properly documented. Deputy Morris, his badge turned in and his crimes pardoned in exchange for testimony, sought her out on their last morning in Fort Sumner.
Miss Brennan, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had looked at himself honestly and not liked what he saw. I'm heading west, Colorado, maybe. Start over where nobody knows what I was. He paused, his hat in his hands. But I wanted you to know, watching you stand up there and tell the truth, when it would have been easier to stay silent, That changed something in me. I'll carry that." Margaret studied his face and saw a genuine transformation there. "Then make sure the change lasts, Deputy. Make it mean something." He nodded once and walked away. A man trying to earn redemption one day at a time. But it was the visit to the homestead itself that truly undid her. Captain Wheeler arranged the trip, bringing Margaret, Sarah, and Cale in a sturdy wagon. Miguel rode alongside as scout, though the threat from Vance's hired guns had evaporated with their employer's imprisonment. The homestead appeared over a low rise in the late afternoon. 40 acres of rocky New Mexico soil, with a small cabin sitting near a creek that ran only seasonally. The structure her father had built with his own hands looked smaller than Margaret remembered, more worn by time and neglect. She climbed down from the wagon slowly, her feet touching ground her parents had walked. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Windows were thick with dust. The small garden her mother had tended with such care was overrun with weeds. Margaret walked to the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. Carved there, almost invisible beneath years of weather, were the words her father had etched the day they moved in. Samuel and Mary and Margaret, 1870. A family, a hope, a future that had been stolen. Inside, dust covered everything like a burial shroud. The table where they had eaten meals together still stood against one wall. Her father's books, his precious books, lined a crude shelf he had built. Her mother's dried herbs still hung from the rafters, brittle now, but recognizable. Margaret moved through the space like a ghost visiting its own haunting. Here was where her mother had taught her to read. There was where her father had shown her the stars through the window, naming constellations. In that corner, she had hidden when her uncle's rages grew too frightening. She found herself in what had been her parents' room. Their bed was gone. Nothing remained but 4 marks in the dust where the legs had stood. But on a shelf, covered in years of neglect, sat her mother's silver brush and her father's pipe. Margaret picked up the brush, and something inside her finally cracked. She sank to the floor, clutching the tarnished silver, and wept. Not the quiet tears she had shed before, but great wrenching sobs that came from a place deeper than words. She cried for her parents, for the childhood stolen from her, for 3 years of abuse, and for the weeks of terror that had followed. She cried because she had won, and winning had not brought them back. Sarah found her there some time later, curled on the dusty floor with the brush held against her heart. The older woman knelt beside her, saying nothing, just placing a hand on Margaret's shaking shoulders. Waiting. Witnessing. Present in the grief without trying to fix it. When the storm finally passed, Margaret wiped her eyes and looked up. "I can't live here," she said, her voice hoarse. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. This place is full of ghosts." "Well, then we make it something else," Sarah said gently. "Wheeler has a proposal. He was going to wait, but perhaps now is the time." They returned to the yard where Wheeler, Cale, and Miguel waited. The captain studied Margaret's tear-stained face with compassion, but did not comment on it. "Miss Brennan," he began, "Wheeler's Valley grows each season. We need more land for crops, for families seeking refuge. Your 40 acres sits on good water, and the soil, while rocky, can be improved." Margaret felt a flutter of panic. "You want to buy it?" "No. I want to incorporate it into the valley. You would deed the land to the community cooperative. In return, you'd have a place in Wheeler's Valley for as long as you choose to stay. When you turn 18, you'd have full voice in the council that governs us. And if you ever wanted to leave, the cooperative would buy out your share at fair value." "You're asking me to give up my inheritance." "I'm asking you to transform it from a monument to loss, into a place of hope. Wheeler gestured toward the cabin. Your parents built this homestead believing in community and education. They died because one man chose greed over family. Don't let their land perpetuate that legacy. Let it become something that would make them proud. Margaret looked at the cabin, at the land stretching away in every direction. She thought about her father's books gathering dust inside, about her mother's healing knowledge going unused, about the isolation that had made them vulnerable to Silas's scheme. Then she thought about Wheeler's Valley, where different peoples worked side by side, where children of various backgrounds learned together, where outcasts had found family and purpose. "What would you call it?" she asked. "Brennan Fields," Wheeler said immediately. "So their names live on. So anyone who settles there knows the story of the family who chose education over ignorance, healing over harm, hope over hate." Margaret's hand went to the wooden hawk Cale had given her, its weight a comfort against her heart. "My father always said knowledge couldn't be stolen like gold, that learning was the only true path forward." "Then let his wisdom shape this place," Wheeler said. "Let Brennan Fields become a school and a farm, a place where people learn to grow food and grow minds, where your parents' legacy is remembered not in how they died, but in how they lived." Margaret looked at Cale, who had remained silent through the entire conversation. "What do you think?" The Apache warrior considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think your parents would want their daughter to be free more than they would want her to be tied to land. But I also think they would want their land to serve others, to be part of something larger than one family's claim." "Will you stay?" Margaret asked him. "At the valley, I mean, not just passing through." Cale's expression softened in that rare way that transformed his entire face. "I have walked alone for many years, belonging to neither world. But you have taught me that bridges can be built, not just crossed. If Wheeler's Valley will have me, I will stay. Perhaps teach others to walk between worlds without losing themselves." Something shifted in Margaret's chest, some final piece falling into place. She turned back to Wheeler. "I have conditions." "Name them." "Brennan Fields becomes a school first, a farm second. Anyone who wants to learn is welcome, regardless of color or background. And my parents' books, they form the core of the library. Those are my terms." Wheeler extended his hand. "Those are good terms, Miss Brennan. We have an agreement." They shook, two survivors of different struggles binding themselves to a common cause. Around them, the New Mexico desert stretched away in shades of red and gold, harsh and beautiful, unforgiving, yet full of hidden life. That evening, they made camp near the creek. Miguel built a fire, and Sarah produced supplies for a proper meal. As night fell and stars emerged overhead, the small group settled into comfortable silence. Margaret sat slightly apart, looking at the cabin silhouetted against the darkening sky. Tomorrow they would begin the work of transforming loss into legacy. Tomorrow she would start the journey from victim to builder, from orphan to teacher, from the girl left to die to the young woman who had chosen how to live. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply be, to exist in this moment between endings and beginnings, to honor her grief while acknowledging her survival. Cale approached, moving with his characteristic quiet grace. He settled beside her, not touching, but close enough that she felt his presence like warmth from a fire. "You made a good choice," he said. "Did I? Or did I just give away the only thing I have left of them?" "You transformed it into something they would have wanted. That is not giving away. That is honoring." He looked at the stars overhead. "Among my people, we believe the dead watch over us from the sky. They see what we do with their memories. Your parents see you choosing education over revenge, community over isolation. They are proud. Margaret felt tears threaten again, but these were different. Cleaner, somehow. I'm tired, Cale. So tired of fighting. Then rest. The fighting is done. What comes next is building. That is different work, and you do not have to do it alone. She leaned against his shoulder, and he accepted her weight without comment. They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had somehow become essential to each other's survival. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. And somewhere in that vast darkness, Margaret chose to believe her parents watched over her still, pleased that their daughter had survived, had fought, had won. Pleased that their land would serve others. Pleased that their legacy would be measured in learning rather than loss. The desert wind whispered through the scrub brush, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new paths to walk. But tonight, Margaret Brennan was at peace. The courtroom victory had delivered justice, but it could not resurrect the dead or erase 3 years of suffering. What it had done was close one chapter so another could begin. Tomorrow, the work of transformation would start, turning land soaked in betrayal into soil that could nurture hope. She had not gained back what was lost, but she had discovered who she was beneath the fear and silence. The real self, the strong self, the self her parents had raised her to become. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all. 7 days had passed since Judge Cole pronounced sentence. 7 days during which Margaret and her companions had returned to Wheeler's Valley, only to ride back to Fort Sumner on the morning of the 7th day. The law required public execution, and Margaret had decided she needed to witness the final chapter. The morning of Silas Brennan's execution dawned clear and cold. Marshal Garrett had offered to escort her, but it was Cale who stood beside her in the crowd that gathered outside Fort Sumner's newly built gallows. Sarah Wheeler was there too, a steady presence on her other side. The townspeople had turned out in force, some driven by morbid curiosity, others by a genuine hunger for justice, after years of watching Clayton Vance's corruption go unchallenged. Silas was led out just after dawn, his hands bound, his face the color of old parchment. He had lost weight in the week since his sentencing. His eyes, when they found Margaret in the crowd, held something that might have been regret, or might simply have been fear of the rope waiting for him. Judge Cole stood on the platform, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Silas Brennan, you have been convicted of the murders of Samuel and Mary Brennan and the attempted murder of Margaret Brennan. You confessed to these crimes before witnesses. Have you any final words? Silas swayed slightly. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I'm sorry. God knows I'm sorry. I thought the money would solve everything. I thought. He stopped, his gaze finding Margaret again. Your mother was kind to me once, when I had nothing. Your father called me brother, and I repaid them with poison. I deserve this rope. I deserve worse. His voice broke completely. Margaret, I know you can't forgive me. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just ask that you don't let what I did poison you the way greed poisoned me. Don't let hate make you hard. Your parents wouldn't want that." Margaret felt Cale's hand find hers, squeezing gently. She wanted to shout that Silas had forfeited any right to speak about what her parents would have wanted, but the words stayed locked in her throat. This broken man on the gallows was already beyond her anger or her forgiveness. In minutes, he would face whatever judgment waited beyond death. The hood was placed over Silas's head. The noose tightened around his neck. Judge Cole nodded to the executioner, and the trap door opened with a sound like thunder. It was quick. Cale had told her it would be, that the fall would break the neck instantly if the rope was measured correctly. He had been right. Silas Brennan jerked once, then hung still, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Margaret watched until the doctor pronounced him dead, and they cut him down. Then she turned away, feeling nothing like the satisfaction she had expected, just a hollow sense that something terrible and necessary had been completed. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked quietly. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I thought seeing him die would make me feel something, but I just feel empty." "That's because revenge and justice aren't the same thing," Cale said. "Revenge is hot and consuming. Justice is cold and final. It closes doors, but doesn't open new ones. That part is still ahead." They walked back through Fort Sumner's dusty streets as the town began its normal business around them. Life continued, indifferent to one man's death, just as it had continued indifferent to the deaths of Samuel and Mary Brennan 3 years before. But something had changed in that indifference. The people of Fort Sumner had watched one of their own hang for murder. They had seen Clayton Vance, with all his money and influence, sentenced to hard labor. The message was clear. Justice could reach anyone, given enough courage to speak truth. At the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson was waiting. The older woman's face held an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Sadness, perhaps, mixed with something that looked like pride. "Your uncle is buried now," she said simply, "in the paupers section. I thought you'd want to know." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." Mrs. Patterson's hand lingered briefly on Margaret's shoulder. "I should have spoken 3 years ago when I first suspected something was wrong with your parents' deaths. I said nothing." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I won't make that mistake again. Women must speak for each other." Margaret covered the older woman's hand with her own. "You spoke when it mattered most. That's what I'll remember." Mrs. Patterson nodded, composing herself. "There's something else." The landlady reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Silas gave this to the marshal last night. Asked that it be delivered to you after." "Silas gave this to the marshal last night. Asked that it be delivered to you after." Margaret took the paper with trembling fingers. Inside, written in her uncle's shaky hand, were only a few lines. "Margaret, the deed to the homestead is in the strongbox at the land office. Password is Mary's birthday. There's also $73 from selling the milk cow. It should have been yours all along. I'm sorry for more than I know how to say. Your father was a better man than I ever was. Be like him, not like me. Silas." Margaret read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. It changed nothing and everything. The money would help rebuild Brennan Fields. The acknowledgement of her father's goodness was something she would keep close to her heart. "I'm going to the land office," she told Sarah, "to get the deed and the money. Then I'd like to go back to the valley." "Of course. We'll leave this afternoon if you're ready." But first, Margaret had one more stop to make. She found Clayton Vance's confiscated office above the saloon, now stripped of its expensive furnishings and being inventoried by territorial officials. Among the papers and ledgers spread across a bare table, she found what she was looking for. A map, detailed and precise, showing the proposed route of the Santa Fe Railroad. Her family's homestead was marked with a small red circle, along with dozens of other properties Vance had targeted for acquisition. Names were written beside each circle, some crossed out with dates that likely represented completed transactions or deaths. Margaret studied the map, seeing her parents' murders not as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a larger pattern of greed and manipulation. How many other families had Vance destroyed? How many other children had lost parents to his schemes? She rolled up the map carefully and took it. Evidence, perhaps, for future investigations, or simply a reminder that her parents had died fighting against something larger than one man's cruelty. They had died resisting a system that valued profit over people, progress over justice. Their daughter would continue that fight in her own way, not with violence, but with education, not through revenge, but through building something better. The journey back to Wheeler's Valley took 3 days, and with each mile, Margaret felt the tension that had coiled around her heart begin to loosen. The desert landscape that had nearly killed her now felt almost welcoming, as if the land itself had decided she had earned passage through its harsh beauty. On the second night, as they made camp beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Cale told her a story. It was something his people did, he explained. When someone survived a great trial, the elders would tell them the story of the hawk who fell from its nest. "The young hawk falls," Cale began, his voice taking on the cadence of an old tale. "And all the other birds say it will die. The ground is too far. The hawk is too small. But the hawk does not accept what others say is possible. It beats its wings, though they are weak. It climbs air that tries to push it down. And slowly, impossibly, the hawk returns to the sky." He looked at Margaret across the flickering fire. "You were that hawk. Your uncle pushed you from the nest, expecting you to fall and break. But you beat your wings, you climbed, and now you fly." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I couldn't have done it alone. No hawk flies alone at first, but you will. When you are ready, you will teach others how to beat their wings against impossible wind. That is the gift survivors give. They show others what is possible." The following afternoon, Wheeler's Valley appeared before them like a mirage made real. But this time, Margaret saw it differently. Not as a refuge she was fleeing to, but as a home she was returning to. A place where her efforts would matter, where her parents' legacy would live on in more than memory. The community gathered to greet them, dozens of faces from different backgrounds united in welcome. Elena Cortez embraced Margaret like a daughter. Miguel regaled the younger children with an embellished version of the courtroom drama. Thomas Rain, the Navajo elder, blessed Margaret with words in his own language that she didn't understand but felt in her bones. Captain Wheeler waited until the commotion died down before approaching. "Welcome home, Miss Brennan. Or should I say, welcome home, teacher." "Teacher?" "Brennan Fields will need someone to run the school. Sarah's willing to help you get started, but the position is yours if you want it." He smiled slightly. 14 is young to be an instructor, but then you've proven age is less important than character." Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her. Children who would benefit from her parents' books. Families who would work the land her parents had claimed. A community that would remember the Brennan name not for how they died, but for what they built. "I want it," she said. But I need to learn more first. I need to be good enough to honor what my parents believed in. Then Sarah will teach you, and you'll help with the younger students while you learn. In a few years, you'll be ready to run the whole school yourself." Wheeler extended his hand. "Deal?" "Deal." The seasons turned with the rhythm of desert life. Summer gave way to autumn's cooler nights, then winter's surprising cold. Through it all, transformation came steadily to both Margaret and Brennan Fields. Brennan Fields took shape slowly but surely, with community members contributing labor and resources. The old cabin was repaired and expanded into a proper schoolhouse. Her father's books were carefully cleaned and shelved, forming the core of a growing library. Margaret threw herself into learning with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. Sarah proved to be a demanding but effective teacher, and by winter, Margaret was confident enough to teach reading to the younger children, while continuing her own education in mathematics, history, and natural sciences. Cale remained at the Valley, taking on the role of scout and sometime translator, but also becoming something unexpected, a teacher of cultural understanding. He helped Apache children maintain connection to their heritage while learning the skills they'd need to navigate an increasingly white-dominated territory. He helped white children see past the stereotypes and fear that had been drilled into them. And he remained Margaret's closest friend, the person she turned to when memories of her parents became too heavy or when doubts about her abilities threatened to overwhelm her. 9 months after her abandonment, spring arrived, with wildflowers carpeting the desert. On Margaret's 15th birthday, in March 1877, the community gathered at Brennan Fields for a celebration that doubled as the school's official dedication ceremony. Judge Cole had made the journey from Fort Sumner specifically for the occasion. He stood before the assembled crowd, his stern features softened slightly by approval. "I have practiced law on this frontier for 30 years, he began. "I've seen this territory at its worst, violent, lawless, driven by greed and prejudice. But I've also seen it at its best, in moments like this, when people choose cooperation over conflict, when they choose education over ignorance, when they remember that justice is not just about punishing wrongdoing, but about building something better in its place." He gestured toward the schoolhouse. Brennan Fields stands as a monument to that better vision. Samuel and Mary Brennan died believing in education and community. Their daughter has ensured that belief lives on. 3 years ago, Margaret Brennan was an orphan with no future. Today, she is a teacher shaping the futures of dozens of children. That is the real victory over Clayton Vance and Silas Brennan. Not their punishment, but this proof that hope survives, that good work continues, that one girl's courage can inspire an entire community. The crowd applauded, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn. But she stood straight, accepting the recognition with the dignity Sarah had taught her. She was no longer the frightened child left to die in the desert. She had become someone else, someone stronger, someone purposeful. As the celebration wound down and people began departing for their own homes, Margaret found herself alone at her parents' graves. Wheeler had arranged for their bodies to be exhumed from the pauper's field, where Silas had buried them, and reinterred here at Brennan Fields, beneath a stone marker that read, "Samuel and Mary Brennan, teachers, healers, dreamers." Their legacy lives in every child who learns, every student who grows, every mind that opens to possibility. She knelt between the graves, placing wildflowers on each. "We did it," she whispered. "Your land is a school now. Children learn here. All kinds of children, from all backgrounds, exactly what you would have wanted. The wind carried her words away across the desert. Margaret stayed there a long time, feeling her parents' presence not as ghosts, but as a foundation beneath her feet. They had built this place with hope. She had reclaimed it with courage. Together they had created something that would outlast both their lives and their deaths. Cale found her as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He settled beside her without speaking, his presence a comfort that required no words. "Do you ever regret staying?" Margaret asked after a while. "You were free before, traveling where you wanted. Now you're tied to this place." "I was not free before. I was lost." Cale looked out at the desert, stretching away to the horizon. "I spent years as an outsider to both my peoples, never fully Apache, never accepted by whites. Now I build bridges between them. That is different. That is purpose." "Because of me?" "Because of you, because of Wheeler, because of everyone here who chose to create something new instead of accepting what others said was possible." He glanced at her. "You taught me that, flame-haired one. You taught me that surviving is not enough, that thriving is the true victory." Margaret reached for his hand, and he accepted hers without hesitation. They sat together as darkness gathered, two people whose unlikely meeting had changed both their lives irrevocably. Above them, the first stars appeared, and Margaret thought about her mother teaching her their names: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Pleiades. Her father explaining how ancient peoples had used those stars to navigate impossible journeys. She was on her own impossible journey now, from abandoned child to teacher, from victim to survivor to builder. The journey was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But she no longer faced them alone. She had found her people, her purpose, her voice, and that voice, once silenced by fear and cruelty, now rang clear and strong across Wheeler's Valley and beyond. Speaking truth, teaching hope, building the future her parents had dreamed of but never lived to see. Margaret Brennan had been left to die in the desert, but the desert had not claimed her. Instead, it had tempered her like steel in a forge, burning away weakness and leaving only strength. She stood, helping Cale to his feet. Together they walked back toward the lights of the settlement, where families gathered for evening meals and children played in the last of the daylight, where people of different worlds lived side by side, proving every day that cooperation was stronger than conflict, that understanding was wiser than fear. Tomorrow, Margaret would teach reading to 6-year-olds and practice mathematics with Sarah. She would help Elena in the community garden and listen to Thomas Raine's stories about his people's history. She would laugh with Miguel and plan curriculum with Captain Wheeler. Tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, she would live the life her parents had wanted for her. A life of learning and teaching, of building and growing, of finding family not through blood, but through choice and courage and shared purpose. The girl who had been abandoned in the desert had found her way home. Not to the place she had lost, but to the place she had helped create. Not to the past, but to the future. And that future, shaped by her voice and her vision, stretched out before her like the desert itself, vast, challenging, beautiful, and full of unexpected life. Margaret smiled as she walked through the gathering darkness, Cale beside her, the lights of Wheeler's Valley beckoning them home. She had spoken truth to power, and power had broken. She had survived the desert and made it bloom. Now she would spend the rest of her life helping others find their own voices, their own strength, their own paths from darkness into light. That was her parents' legacy. That was her gift to the world.
That was the true voice of the desert. Not the howl of the wind or the cry of the coyote, but the sound of hope refusing to die, of courage standing against impossible odds, of one girl's determination to transform tragedy into triumph. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, that voice echoed across the New Mexico territory, carrying a message that would outlive them all. Justice can be achieved. Truth can prevail. And from the hardest soil, given enough courage and care, the most beautiful things can grow.